Welcome to the Black Male Impact. Today we have as guest with us Dr. Chike Akua. He's an exceptional educator, international speaker, and he has been doing tremendous work, not just for students, but for teachers across the country, and I would say across the world. Dr. Akua, welcome to the Black Male Impact.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cross. It's great to be here with you.
Man, it's a pleasure having you. But before we get into the conversation, I would love for you to share with the listeners something about you so they can have a feel of who you are.
Sure. I'm excited that this is actually my 30th year in education. I started as a middle school language arts and literature teacher. Also served as a reading specialist. And during my time as a teacher, one of the things that I noticed is that the curriculum was not structured to meet the needs of the students that I was serving. And so I began developing curriculum resources, African-centered curriculum resources, culturally relevant and responsive curriculum resources to meet the needs of my students. And that began reaching a wider audience of teachers and educational leaders and parents and so forth. And so those offerings have expanded tremendously over the years, in the form of online curricula, in the form of Black history and African proverb posters, and so many different things. And so we provide professional development, leadership strategy, and support to urban school districts, colleges, and universities. And so I'm really thankful to be in a situation where I can support Black students at the college and university level, as well as at the K through 12 level as well.
Okay, man, I really appreciate it. But before I get into the questions, I have a book here that I wouldn't mind you share just a little bit on, because I know the questions will really capture some of the information in the book. But I think as Black people, this is one thing that we have to do, honor our ancestral obligations. Could you give just a synopsis of that book and how that can be beneficial to the readers and those who serve in, especially our students?
Sure. I came along through the African-centered education movement of the late 80s and early 90s. That was when my cultural and spiritual consciousness was beginning to emerge. And during that time, one of the great scholars among us was Dr. John Henrik Clarke. He was an eminent historian. And Dr. Clarke said something that really caught my attention. He said, when it comes to great Black civilizations, there are two things that held together great Black civilizations: honor and obligation. And that prompted me to ask the question, knowing that we had not been exposed to the best of our culture for the most part, it prompted me to ask this question: how can we honor ancestors that we don't know? And how can we uphold an obligation that we're completely unaware of? And that prompted the title, Honoring Our Ancestral Obligations, because I wanted to write a book that would impact this generation the way that there were certain small books that impacted my generation. So, for example, I was deeply impacted by Naeem Akbar's book, Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. Very thin book, under 100 pages, right? I was impacted by Carter G. Woodson's The Miseducation of the Negro, Tony Browder's book, From the Browder File. There's so many different books that were like that. Richard A. Williams has a book called They Stole It, But You Must Return It. These were small books that were very impactful to me because they were rich in information, but the language was not above my ability to comprehend it. Because at one time I was an underachieving student, and I had some educational deficiencies that I had to overcome. So these small books helped to bridge that gap until I could read bigger books that had more advanced ideas in them. And so I wanted to write a book that would have that same kind of impact on this generation. And I'm very thankful to say that it's taken hold and it's happening. Hundreds and even thousands of college students are being impacted by that very book that you just held up, Honoring Our Ancestral Obligations, 7 Steps to Black Student Success.
Oh, yes. And I I'm glad that I came across it. But not only that, I was fortunate enough to be in your class. And when you make sure that the information really encompasses our image, ourself, so it can be relatable to what we're doing. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing and how it have impacted me. So I'm going to get into the questions for today's conversation. And my first question to you is, what is the mindset that it takes to make a positive impact?
The mindset that it takes is one of, first of all, deep commitment. And that's one of the things that I love. I'm glad that you mentioned that you were in my class, because I forgot to mention that in addition to the work that I do serving urban school districts and serving as a leadership strategist to colleges and universities, I'm an assistant professor of educational leadership at Clark Atlanta University. And of course, that's where I met you. And it's a blessing to be able to work with brilliant and committed young minds just like yourself. So when you talk about the mindset that it takes to be successful, we have to engage in different activities that will help us to build the mental and emotional muscle to push past the barriers that we face as Black men. And many of those barriers have been imposed upon us by society. And some of those barriers are just the natural things that occur in life when you're trying to establish something new. But building that mental and emotional muscle requires that we wake up on a mission every day, that we set our minds every day. And what makes that challenging is it takes some time for whatever the goal that you're pursuing, for it to take root and bear fruit. Even the process of taking root before a plant shows any visible signs of growth above ground that people can see, there's a long period of time when it's underground. And so what that suggests is that we have to work on ourselves constantly, doing the self work, the spirit work, the mental and emotional work to make sure that we're showing up every day on a mission. And here's one of the things that I've found is that if you're not clear about your purpose and your mission, this world and this society will assign you another mission and purpose, and you may not like it. So you don't know your purpose and mission? Fine. Your purpose and mission is to populate the prison industrial complex. You don't know your purpose and your mission? Fine. Your purpose and mission is to be broke. You don't know your purpose and your mission? Fine. Your purpose is to have a family that's broken, right? If you're not very clear about your purpose and your mission, this society will assign you a purpose and a mission, and you may not like what you're assigned. And so you have to be very self-determined, very, very intent on going in a certain direction and not being coerced off track, if that makes sense.
Well, you share a lot there, but just to say what you have said, deep commitment is important if we're going to make a positive impact and if we're going to be successful, and that we have to be willing to get up each day with a focus, know exactly what we want to do and accomplish. Because I know there are a lot of distractions out there.
Yes.
And,
Yeah.
and with distractions, if we're not careful, we may, as you said, we may end up on a path that we don't want to be on, but because we're not focused or we don't have a sense of direction, we may go down on that path. So I really appreciate that perspective. So my next question is, what advice do you have for the men listening and how they can play a role in creating positive change?
Well, one of the things I want to pick up where you left off when you mentioned the distractions that are out there. If you're going to create positive change, you first have to realize that there are many weapons of mass distraction and many weapons of mass deception. So the weapons of mass distraction are the things that take us off purpose. And that could be anything that removes our attention from the most important things that we have to do at hand. So there are many weapons of mass distraction. We see it in social media. We may see it in people who may not have a purpose like we do. And we love them and we want to support them, but we cannot allow others to pull us off track. So we have to be careful and mindful about weapons of mass distraction. People who don't know their purpose, people who don't know their mission, want to take you with them oftentimes and won't understand when you find it necessary to go in a different direction. You may be talked about, you may be misunderstood, and you have to be okay with that, okay? The weapons of mass deception are the lies that are told about us, lies that are told about us as Black men, about our capabilities, about our possibilities, and different things of that nature. So we have to be mindful of the weapons of mass deception and the weapons of mass distraction. And then what we have to do is make sure, as I said before, that we're focused on a particular path. When you're focused on a particular path and you do that consistently, what happens is that you radiate a certain quality of energy that is magnetic, and it draws other people to you in the same way that you contacted me for this interview. You know the path that I'm on, you know the consistency with which I operate, and that attracted you to want to learn more about that and expose that to those that are in your sphere of influence. And so when you're consistent, when you're on purpose, when you're on mission, that attracts to you your tribe. It attracts to you the people that are of like mind that can assist you on your path. And so that's why it's so important. I'll never forget Dr. Miles Monroe, an amazing teacher and author and minister. He said, once you understand your purpose and your mission, 95% of your decisions are really already made, because you're walking on such a narrow path. I don't mean narrow-minded, but a narrow path in the sense that, as the scripture says, straight is the gate and narrow is the way to the kingdom. So these are some of the things that we have to be mindful of when we're walking in complete purpose and mission.
I really appreciate that, especially reminding us about the mass distraction. How did you say that? Mass distraction and
weapons of mass distraction and weapons of mass deception. Lies that are told about us. Yes.
Yes, and I'm glad that you remind us of that, because if we again, if we're not careful, we end up on paths that we don't want to be on, because we're listening or feeding into the lies or the falsifications that when it comes to us as Black people or Black men, especially, and then we limit ourselves based on those limitations or falsifications that has been shared or socially constructed when it comes to us. So I really appreciate that perspective, and I know the listeners will also appreciate it as well. So I'm going to go into my next question, and most of these questions are somewhat related, but I really want to ask because it gives a deeper dive into helping us as Black men to create the change that is needed within our communities. How can we as Black men help to change the narrative today?
The way that we help to change the narrative is first by being the counter narrative, by being our true and authentic selves. When I say authentic, one of the things that I developed is the theory of cultural identity theft. We know that regular identity theft is when someone steals your personal information to gain access to your resources, unbeknownst to you. Well, cultural identity theft is when you steal a people's story. So how do you take the group of people who gave the world reading and writing and language and literature, architecture and engineering, agriculture and astronomy, mathematics and medicine, science and technology? How do you take that group of people and convince them that they're nothing but a race of pimps, players, criminals, thugs, and N-words and B-words? Cultural identity theft. And so this alien cultural identity has been injected into our community and culture, and it obscures our ability to see our authentic identity, which is one of deep power. Everybody else knows how powerful we are except for us, because we have been fed this alien cultural identity. So the best way for us to improve on that is to be who we are, to be what we say we want to see. And in being that, again, that radiates a magnetic quality that attracts all of the right people, all of the right resources, and everything that we need to continue the process of transforming other brothers and sisters. And so I think it's important that we identify those brothers that are of like mind and stick close, because the work that we're called to do, we cannot do it by ourselves. One of the functions of this society is to isolate and thus alienate like-minded brothers, okay? Isolate us. So if you've ever been in a situation where you're feeling like, oh man, am I the only one that's thinking like this? Or there's nobody out here doing the same kind of work I'm trying to do? Or is everybody asleep and I'm the only one that's woke? All of that is for the purpose of isolation, making you feel isolated. And when you feel isolated, you feel alienated from your own people. No, there are a lot of brothers out here that are thinking just like us. They're just looking for platforms and places to come together. And so that's why it's so important that we be on our purpose and mission every single day to organize our people for that purpose. And so the best way to do that is to be what we're wanting to inspire other people to be, to operate with the utmost character. In African tradition, character was the first aspect that was developed in systems of education. So we have to operate with top character so that people know what they're getting into when they deal with us, so that they know that your word is bond and they know that you'll follow through on what you say you're going to do. So those are just a few things that we can do to answer your question.
Man, that's really profound. And it's just the way you say it, especially with the identity theft part and how we are bombarded with the negativity. And if we're not careful, that's what we think we are. And to reinforce or to change that, it starts with us and being that change and help others to see through us what's possible. Because some environments and some communities may not have all the examples for our young people, especially, or even for older adults to realize the possibility. And by being that, others get to see through us what is possible. And I think just listening to you, and not just here, but when in your class, you remind us how important it is for us to be on purpose for a purpose, so we are not distracted or get carried away by the misconceptions or misrepresentations when it comes to who we are and what we are capable of. And I really appreciate that perspective when, especially now in today's society, when we're talking about creating change. And one thing that you said also is really important, and I started to realize this myself of recent, where you're thinking that you're thinking what you're thinking alone. But when you reach out to others, you realize they share the same belief, the same perspective, and want to create the same kind of change that you want to create. And since I started this journey, the Black Male Impact, man, so many people have reached out to me. And when I reach out to some of the individuals that I've been connected to for over some time now, I realized, man, they were so excited to want to share. And that really solidified what you just said, that you're not thinking this way by yourself. Sometimes we just have to reach out.
Yeah, people are looking for leadership and they're waiting for leadership. They're looking for people to organize us around these different things. In order for us to do that, we have to be willing to stand out. A lot of people they just want to fit in, but you have to be willing to stand out. And to be honest, that's one of the first things that I noticed about you in my class. Every day you came suited and booted to class.
Yes, sir.
Now, that wasn't an expectation of mine. That's not an expectation of the institution, but you came suited and booted to class every day. At the time, most people are coming in jeans or sweats, which is fine. I don't have a problem with that. But it immediately distinguished you from everybody else. It was very, very clear from day one that you were on a mission, because it was something in your whole aura, your whole spirit, your whole energy field. When I go out, you see me dressed as I'm dressed now. That is an immediate thing that sets me apart in some ways from other people. And it's not just to gain attention or something like that, but it does let people know, oh, this brother's doing something that maybe the average person is not doing. And so we have to be willing to stand out. It could be in the way that you dress. It could just be the spirit and the energy that you walk in. But for those brothers that are watching this, you have to be willing to stand out. And by the way, that's what it means to be outstanding.
That's right.
Is to be willing to stand out.
Yes, sir. And some people tend to be afraid. But when you're on a mission and you want to create change, as you just mentioned, we have to. We can't give ourselves any other option than to be that person, to be that change. And even if you're the only one, sometimes you have to be the only one first before others join you on your journey to make an impact. So, and being that, I know I'm committed to this, I know I had to. Wherever I go, you're going to know that I'm there. So that's just one thing that I challenge myself every day to do, because I know there are young people, especially Black males, are looking up to me, not just in my immediate environment, but whenever I'm online, whatever I'm doing, they are looking up to me. So I have an obligation to the next generation to see through me what's possible. So, but I'm going to go into the next question. So, what or who has influenced or inspired you to pursue the path that you're on?
Well, I would definitely have to start with my family. My parents were deeply committed in the work that they did with our family and in the community. My sister and my brothers were very influential. I'm the last of 5 children, so looking at their example was very helpful to me. So definitely my family has had a tremendous impact on the path that I'm on. But even with my family, I still went in a direction that they probably weren't counting on in terms of studying our history and culture and being centered in it and reconnecting us to African traditions as well as indigenous traditions. In terms of the scholars that have deeply influenced and impacted my work, I mentioned before Dr. Naeem Akbar, who's a clinical psychologist and author, whose work deeply transformed my life. Dr. Asa Hilliard, who was a professor at Georgia State University. He transitioned before I started working on my doctorate at Georgia State University, but had a profound impact on my life because he came over to Clark Atlanta University and he started something called the Jegna Collective. Jegna is an Amharic term coming out of Ethiopia, which refers to a master teacher who's been tested in battle. And in starting the Jegna Collective, at that time, I was working on my master's degree at Clark Atlanta University. And so sitting in on those sessions with him and many of the other scholars in the community that they brought in before us to interact with had a profound impact on my development into the person that I am today. And so the legacy that Dr. Hilliard left in his work, also as a psychologist, historian, and educator, was very profound for me. Brother Tony Browder, who I also mentioned some of his books earlier, who is a cultural historian, the first person of African descent to lead an archaeological excavation in Egypt. He's doing absolutely amazing work, and I'm blessed to call him a friend. We were just recently in Ghana a month or so ago where we were both installed as chiefs. So these are some of the people that I've been blessed to know and interact with who have guided me on my path to do the work that I'm called to do. And the work that I'm called to do is really for the resurrection of African people first and the redemption of humanity. The resurrection of African people begins with the transformation of the heart, mind, and spirit through knowledge of self. And accurate and authentic knowledge of who we are, as we mentioned before, has been kept from us. And so a big part of what I do is producing that knowledge of self and then spreading it through lectures, seminars, presentations, books, posters, interviews like this. Yes, so that's a big part of what we do.
Oh, yes, that's great. And as you shared those individuals who have inspired you, which I got the opportunity because I was in your class when you have mentioned, especially Asa Hilliard, which led me to go and purchase a copy of his book. So I have it in my collection. So just listening to you and the people who have inspired you, then in turn inspired us, because not because we didn't know, now we know, so we go out there and try to find those information so we can be empowered to continue on our journey to be the leaders and the influencers that we aspire to be. So I really appreciate you sharing those individuals who have impacted your life. Now they're going to be used as influence to our lives. So I really appreciate you sharing that. So my next question is, what is your perspective on the current climate of Black men in society today?
Well, the current climate of Black men in society today, if we look at the landscape just right now in the media, is one where there is the assumption that we will bend, bow, and break. So there are all these attempts to get us to apologize for who we are, to apologize for the knowledge that we have accumulated, to apologize for the fact that we have, those of us that have reclaimed our memory and can speak to the atrocities that have been perpetrated against us. There's the continuous attempt to get us to surrender our memory and surrender our power. All of this at the same time when many of our young brothers are being mis-socialized and taken in a direction where they're encouraged to uphold these notions of us being pimps, players, criminals, and thugs. And so one of the biggest aspects of the work that we must do is to control the education and socialization of our young people, especially our young brothers, right? And in so doing, we have to take control of that process from those that would prefer to have us strong in body, but weak in mind. So they want us to run and jump and throw and catch and shoot a ball, to be strong in body, but to be weak in mind, to not be able to make decisions for ourselves, to not be able to think for ourselves. Another thing that we have to pay very, very close attention to is the fact that as Black people, we have undergone over 400 years of intergenerational, multi-generational, unaddressed trauma. I'm going to say that again. Intergenerational, from one generation to another. Multi-generational, meaning many generations of unaddressed trauma that came about as the result of our captivity and enslavement. So we've been over 400 years without therapy. A big thing that we have to be clear about as Black men is that we have to have the courage to mind our mental health and to mend our mental health. We have to have the courage to seek help whenever and wherever we can find it and not stop until we find it. So I don't mind letting people know that I'm in therapy. I need help for some things that I experienced in my younger life. And it's just recently in the last year or so that I've really kind of worked on that. And I share that to let brothers know it's okay. There's so many things that we have accepted as normal and natural because that's all we experienced. And it takes oftentimes a trained professional to say, no, that's not normal. That's not natural. And to help us to then begin to deconstruct some of these things that we have accepted as normal and natural. It's not normal or natural for males and females to be engaged in a relationship that's based on violence. That's not normal and that's not natural. It's not normal or natural to be in a state of perpetual poverty. It's not normal or natural to experience police intimidation or police brutality. It's not normal or natural for us to be in a position where we're underemployed or unemployed. All of these unnatural conditions have been imposed upon us. And so when we see a lot of the ills going on in our families and communities, it is oftentimes an unnatural response to unnatural circumstances, an unnatural response to oppression. And so we've been 400 years without therapy. And a big part of our transformation and resurrection rise is going to require that we receive the necessary help to deconstruct the traumas that we've all experienced.
Man, that is powerful. That's a lot of information. I'm not even going to try to uh, go over all that you have said, but we have to understand that there are certain things that we were told, and to change those perceptions of ourselves, we have to sometimes get the help to understand why we act the way we do, why we show up the way we do, because if we don't take the time to understand it, it's going to continue in the next generation and the next generation. And at some point, we have to realize that if it's going to be broken, we have to take a stand and decide that it stopped with me now. And although everything may not change with you as an individual, but it can start with you and start with your family going forward, that it doesn't continue. And you doing it, somebody else may see that you're doing it and say, you know what, man, I see this person doing this, so I'm going to change. I'm going to do something different. So it doesn't continue with my family and stuff like that. And also, you said something that I believe is really important, and where we apologize for who we are or our greatness. I don't think, and I'm really glad you say that, because I think us as men need to understand that you don't dumb yourself down, or we should not dumb ourselves down just to appease those who cannot stand what we are bringing to the table or what we are bringing in the spaces that we are. Because if we belittle ourselves, it gives them no room to, so they don't have to say to us we are inferior, because we already take that on. And I think that's also a part of the miseducation. If we think we are less than, we operate in that manner. And we cannot, if we're going to create change. We have to be as powerful as we can be and let others see, especially the next generation of Black men or Black males, see us standing up within our power to create that change. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And I myself will have to go back and listen to, because sometimes we need that reinforcement in, so we can continue on the journey and remember why we're doing this, because there's so much happening at once. And if we're not careful, we forget or get discouraged, and we cannot allow ourselves to get discouraged. So Dr. Akua, I really appreciate that perspective and reminder to us as we continue on this journey. So my next question is, what change do you want to see in general amongst Black men? And you know, you kind of share that to some extent in the perspective of our current climate. But what change do you want to see in general amongst Black men?
I want to see us walk differently, and I want to see us talk differently. I want to see us reclaim who we truly are. I want to see us interact with our women and children differently. And I believe there are already a lot of brothers out there that are doing this. It's just that the way that we're portrayed oftentimes doesn't reflect this, doesn't reflect the love that we have for our women, doesn't reflect oftentimes the love that we have for our children, oftentimes doesn't reflect our commitment to the causes that are most important. And so I would like to see us not fall for a lot of the tricks that are played upon us. I'd like to see us organize en masse to do the things that are necessary to clean up our families and our communities. And part of that can be explained with this example. And if I recall correctly, Dr. Cross, you used to run track. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
What events did you run track in?
800 and some 400, but mostly 800.
Okay. And so I've seen some of your workouts online, and that's very inspiring as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
I like to use the example of passing the baton in a relay race. The passing of the baton is really the most important part of the race. If it's a sprint or if it's an individual event, they might say, well, the getting off to a great start might be the most important part of the race, or having a strong finish. But in a relay race, the passing of the baton is the most important part of the race, okay? Because the person with the baton has to be running at a certain rate of speed, and the person receiving the baton has to start running at a certain point that's similar to the rate of speed of the person who's going to pass it to them, then they have to put their hand back and they have to grasp it. And they have to do this in stride so that they don't lose time. If the baton is dropped, they're disqualified. Well, this is akin to what Dr. Asa Hilliard called intergenerational cultural transmission. And that is simply passing on the best of what we know to the next generation. And what we find is that there's a gap or a lapse in our ability to pass on the best of what we know to the next generation, because we have, in many cases, too many of our brothers have dropped the baton. They haven't been trained for manhood, and that's not by chance. The society attempts to take our manhood from us. And so one of the things that I've also learned over the years by somebody who used to train Olympic athletes shared with me that there is an exchange zone. And the exchange zone means that if you pass the baton too early, you're disqualified. If you pass the baton too late, you're disqualified. So the exchange zone represents that for this illustration. The exchange zone represents that age range or period of time where we must pass on this powerful cultural knowledge to young brothers coming behind us. And if we don't pass it on, as a people, we will be disqualified from the human family. So it was always impressive to me that it wasn't just you that showed up suited and booted to class every day. It wasn't enough for you to have nice suits. You made a commitment that, no, I'm going to go back and I'm going to find some suits for these other young brothers. And we're going to find a way for them to have suits. And we're going to show them how to wear their suit, how to tie their tie. We're going to show them what it means to represent yourself as a man. That's an example of intergenerational cultural transmission, passing on the best of what we know to the next generation. These are just a few of the things that we have to do to make sure that we're leaving our mark and that we don't leave the education and socialization of young brothers to chance.
Man, again, very, very profound what you just shared. And I'm just going to touch on the part where we pass on the information. And I really I love the analogy about having that time period where we must pass on the information. And if we don't, we can get disqualified. And I also like that you mentioned or bring to the awareness that some of us who have been at the forefront may have dropped the baton because they haven't passed on what they know. And it's very, very important that we share the knowledge, because everyone will not take the initiative to come and get it. But just listening to the analogy you use, the person receiving it should be at some point doing something, because you may give them and they're not ready for it. And that's one thing that we have to start doing, maybe being that person. And in the same time, look out for those individuals who are showing that they want to be the next leader, the change, because they may not have the courage to come up to someone and say, you know what, I want to learn from you. So sometimes just by being in the space, seeing someone making the effort, you can drop some nuggets and say, these are some things that you can do. And hopefully, because again, as you shared with the books that you have read, you read the smaller books first. And once you overcome or grasp the information and develop and become that person, you then move on to more advanced or more complex thoughts as you go on your journey. So, but I really appreciate that analogy, how important it is that we pass on the information or the best of what we know to the next generation. And I can tell you, Dr. Akua, you're doing an excellent job, because I've seen the workshop. I know you are not only saying we should, you're actually doing what you're saying when it comes on to sharing the information to others who are coming behind you, so they too can become leaders and help others to understand themselves first and foremost, because we must understand that we are powerful and that we can achieve just about anything or even more than those who we sometimes think are better. But for some of us, we don't look at it that way. We look at ourselves as being powerful and can do just about anything we put our mind to. So I appreciate, man, the work that you are doing. And myself will be going back over some of the information you share. But you know what? I have your book. So whenever
We got to get you the most recent edition of the book because we revised it. We've
okay.
also added a QR code on the first page that takes you to 15 brief video clips that cover key concepts in the book. So we got to get you the updated revised version. In addition, there's a whole new section called Mastering Our Mental Health. And I touched a little bit upon that earlier, but yeah, we'll get that to you.
Okay. I'm looking forward to it. So I'm going to go into the next question. What was a pivotal moment in your life?
Pivotal moment in my life was when I went from being a chronically underachieving student to becoming a successful student. And when I did that, I was barely able to get into college, but I was able to get in on probation. And I tell people that a Black college saved my life, plain and simple. I was accepted to Hampton University on probation. They said if I go to the Summer Bridge pre-college program and maintain at least a 2.0 GPA, then they would accept me as a full-time student. Problem was, I didn't have the money to go to pre-college, and my sister put up the money for me to go. She was taking a cab to work every day. She didn't have a car. And I was told at first that was the money that she was saving to get a car. I later found out that was actually her rent money that she used to send me to pre-college. So when I looked at that and all the sacrifices that my parents had made for me, I just went through a dramatic transformation, and I didn't get a 2.0 in pre-college. I got a 4.0 and never looked back. But being at Hampton University and HBCU, I was surrounded by Black excellence. And one of the things that I tell people is that at predominantly white institutions, the intelligence of Black students is called into question. But at HBCUs, it's called into action. One more time, at predominantly white institutions, the intelligence of Black students is oftentimes called into question. But at HBCUs, it's called into action. So I went to a high school. It was a college prep high school where I was one of only 8 Black males in my graduating class. My intelligence was called into question. Wow. The one class that I was doing well in, expository writing, I would routinely get a 95 or a 100 on my papers every week. But one week I got a paper back and the teacher didn't have a grade on it. It just said, "See me." And when I went up to see him, he went through several words on my paper and asked me the definitions, and I gave him the definitions, but he still just looked at me and said, "You didn't write this paper." And so it was very clear to me that my intelligence was being called into question. At PWIs, predominantly white institutions, oftentimes the intelligence of Black students is called into question, but at HBCUs, it's called into action. When I went to Hampton University and I was surrounded by Black excellence, I was surrounded by professors that expected me to be the best. And when I wasn't my best, they lit a fire under me to help me to step up to my power. When I went to Clark Atlanta University to work on my master's degree, same thing, surrounded by Black excellence, had professors who expected the best of me. And so when you ask what were those pivotal moments in my life, those were those pivotal moments. Being able to be in those institutions where people saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. And that's why I always encourage young people that when you're looking at where you want to go to college, at least examine the possibilities of HBCUs first. And if you decide to go to a non-HBCU in undergrad, then consider going to an HBCU for grad school, okay? Those are the things that have deeply impacted and transformed my life.
Man, that's also very profound, especially when you shared where our intelligence are questioned in a predominantly white institution and put into action at an HBCU, because that encourages you and that empowers you and that, pushes you to want to do more of what you're doing. So it forces you to become better because it's being reinforced and encouraged what you're doing. So I really appreciate that perspective. And again, I will say, being in your class, that's one thing that you also reinforce and challenge us to do or to become better. So again, I appreciate that perspective, and I know the listeners will also appreciate it. So my next question to you: what life lesson have you learned late in life that you believe is important and that can benefit this generation?
I think the most important lesson that I've learned later in life, and I'm 52 years old, or as I say to my sons, 52 years old in earth years. I like to say that I'm an eternal spirit, older than the hills, more ancient than the stars, but young at heart. But at this stage of my life, the most important lesson that I've learned is the need for us to master our mental health, which I talked about earlier, that this accumulated, unaddressed trauma has us acting from a reactive mind. And that's one of the reasons why we continue to experience the same challenges, trials, and traumas over and over again, because we have never addressed things that we encountered in our childhood or earlier in our young adulthood, where if we were given the tools to unravel some of those challenges, I think we would find ourselves in a very, very different place. And so when we determine to become men and stand up as men, this society does not support that. As a matter of fact, it militates against it. When we desire to establish loving, sustainable relationships with our women, a lot of times we have not been provided the example to do so, and we have been pitted against each other and not given the tools to create sustainable relationships. Same things in our relationships with our children. And so if we desire to change all that, then that requires that we seek after a different quality of knowledge and seek after a different quality of consciousness that cannot be found on the latest reality show and may not be found scrolling through social media. It's going to be found in a deep spiritual and cultural quest for what our ancestors referred to as rekshanu, which is knowledge of self, knowledge of self. And so when we passionately pursue that, we will begin to be able to reconstruct our families and our communities, and we will begin to walk on the path of the resurrection of our people and the redemption of humanity.
And thanks for sharing. I could listen to your perspective all day because it's refreshing and helps you to really look at your own actions and the things that you do and why we do them. So I really appreciate the perspective, and it helps to reinforce some of the things that we need to do as we go forward. But as you shared, one of the things that we need to focus on as we go forward is mastering our mental health. And I think that cannot be stressed too much, because going forward, we're going to need to be able to do that, to really take control of what we do going forward. So I really appreciate that. But before I ask my final question, I want to ask you, where can the listeners find you and help support the exceptional work that you're doing?
Sure, thank you. You can find me at readingrevolution.org, readingrevolution.org. And if you go to that website and click on books by Dr. Akua, that's where you'll find all of our books, including the one that we referenced earlier, entitled Honoring Our Ancestral Obligations. So again, readingrevolution.org. Another great website would be drakua.net. That's DRAKUA.net, DRAKUA.net. For those that are listening, if you work in a school, whether that's K through 12 or college or university, I would love to share a message with those that you work with, whether that's faculty and staff, whether that's students or parents. And I'd also like for you to consider some of the resources that we have for K through 12 students as well as with higher education students.
Okay, thanks. And we'll share some contacts in the comment area so they can find you as well. So my final question to you is, what impact do you want to have on the world?
The impact that I want to have on the world, everything that I do is two sides of the same coin. Again, the resurrection of African people and the redemption of humanity. And from my perspective, you can't have one without the other. We will not see the redemption of humanity without first seeing the resurrection of African people. The resurrection of African people, when I say the resurrection of African people, I'm talking about restoring our people to their traditional greatness. If I could use the words of Dr. Malana Karenga, restoring our people to their traditional greatness, restoring our neighborhoods and communities as safe places where our children can play, where our women and elders and brothers can walk down the street with complete safety. When I took my son to Ghana with me last month, he said something very interesting. He said, I've never felt this safe before. Wow. Being out in public and different things of that nature, when we look at the volatile cultural and political climate in America, he said he's never felt that safe before. I was like, wow. And I just hadn't considered that. But there is a certain type of peace and exhale that you feel when you go overseas to the motherland. Wow. And so we have to reestablish that sense of peace, that sense of safety and security in our families and in our communities. So again, what I want to be remembered for is that I made my contribution to the resurrection of African people and the redemption of humanity, that we provided resources that would allow us to reconnect to the best of our culture, and that we inspired people spiritually to reconnect to our divine selves. That's my work, and that's what I would like to be remembered for.
And thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Akua, man, it's a pleasure having you here on the Black Male Impact. And I don't want this to be our only conversation, because I know you have a lot more to share and a lot more that the audience needs to hear. But again, man, I want to thank you for taking the time to sharing with us here on the Black Male Impact.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your patience and helping to set up this date. I've been traveling quite a bit, but it was very important to me to be able to connect with you and your audience, and I'm looking forward to continue a dialogue.
Yes, sir. I really appreciate it, man. Thank you.